Hey, evening, everyone. So now begins the crash course for the next 3 months or so for the BAC. So we've enjoyed our longish rest getting smart on the budget, and now, for us, the work begins. So hope everyone had ample time to take a look at it. For those who needed hard copies, I hope that went smoothly. But at the end of the day, a little bit different outcome on the budget than what I expected. I know we'll have a long discussion about each of our individual thoughts on what we perceive with the budget, and then we'll talk the way ahead, particularly with the opportunity that we are going to have in the budget work session in April, where we as the BAC will get to have about an hour with the school board and be able to provide our advice and views on what we see in the budget, and inform the school board as a group how we look at this budget. For those who are new, this is a departure from what we've done in the past. Normally, we would get allocated time with the school board to, I would have a short presentation, some Q&A, and that would be about it. This switch in the format where we participate in one of the work sessions as a group as a whole is an older practice, but one that I think will welcome and be able to provide us to provide an opportunity on what we see, and to render our advice to the board. So with that, we'll go ahead and get started with our agenda. So first off, meeting's called to order, and then open it up for public comment.
So this is Reg Gakey, if you can hear me.
Yep, we got you, Reg.
Great, thank you. So on behalf of Arlington Parents for Education, I just wanted to make a couple quick comments. I've sent in some comments to Chuck, who has the letter that we sent to the board. And I apologize. I literally had to step out of a meeting to jump onto this call, so I don't have any notes in front of me, but I can do most of it from memory. I think, on the one hand, we think that the budget that has been proposed shows some good steps. We definitely applaud the increase in salary for our teachers. We would say, based on our benchmarking of what the other local districts are doing, that it is likely not going to be enough. If you want to be in the top 3 in the local districts, you have to pay more in order to attract teachers. From a perspective of delivering quality education to our students, we think having quality teachers is probably one of the most important things we can do, and we would continue to encourage the school to look for ways to find resources to put there. Second, we also applaud the decision to decrease the size of classes. We would say, however, that it needs to go further. Right now, what has happened is that the decrease in enrollment and the decrease in teacher sizes that would have resulted from that enrollment has been offset by a decrease in class sizes, such that we're not actually hiring any new teachers. We think ultimately if you look at the WABE benchmarks, Arlington was, at the largest, amongst the largest in the region in terms of class sizes, even before the last couple of years. And we think that ultimately we need to keep shrinking the class sizes in order to more effectively deliver education. So those are 2 key elements. The third element we would say is missing from this is any investment in learning loss recovery. If you look at what our neighboring districts have done, many of them have invested a substantial amount in tutoring and after-school programs for our students. If you look at Fairfax, they put the equivalent of 1.6% of their budget towards tutoring programs. We've not done any of that in the last year since the return. And we know that Arlington recognizes the need for this. They had asked the state for $15 million. They got $2 million, which means by their own reckoning, they're short by $13 million. We would ask that they find an additional $10 million to make that happen. Now, the question, of course, is always, where is the money going to come from? And, you know, the first observation we would make is we are literally the highest in terms of cost per student as a district. And if we're not the highest in terms of teacher compensation and we're not the smallest in terms of class sizes, then we're probably doing something incorrect. And from what you can tell from the WABE benchmarks, one of those things is that we have more non-student facing positions than most every other district in the region. And so we would encourage Arlington to look for positions that can be shifted from non-student facing to student facing. The second thing is, obviously, we have some reserves left over from last year. I'm a fiscal conservative myself, so I don't like using reserves, but we would say that, you know, the reserves are there basically as a rainy day fund, and we have literally had a deluge of rain, a typhoon, as you might say. And if there was a time to use some reserves to help our students, this would be it. And then the third is we would encourage and have encouraged the board to work with the county to see if there are ways to get additional support. The county numbers are obviously much higher this year than they've been in past years. So I was happy about that. I think we might ask for some additional support for learning loss recovery in the next year and a half. So I wanted to pass that along. As I said, Chuck does have a letter from us, which we also sent to the school board, and I'd ask if possible for that to be circulated, and appreciate any support you all can give in terms of your agenda to those elements.
Rich, thanks. Yeah, and absolutely. We'll now that you've had the opportunity to speak, I'll go ahead and circulate that amongst the BAC. But appreciate your input.
Good, thank you.
Yep, Josh.
Sorry, had to get my phone on. So I've spoken to of several people, and some people have seen my postings on AEM where I did my summaries of the budget. I do have my book. I did my homework. I've got about 5 pages of notes on things, but not things that I'm going to really discuss here, though I invite anyone to reach out with me, and I'd be happy to sit over coffee with them and go over some of the more detailed things. This is the first year in a very long time that I haven't been just frustrated beyond all belief because I was, fighting for anything in compensation. It feels nice. So I appreciate that stuff. One of the things is we're putting a lot of money into compensation, and as the gentleman before has alluded to, that I am too concerned that I'm calling it shelf life of the current plan may not be that long because other districts are throwing money in it. I'm using the NASCAR reference. Well, we're not in the lead, we are in the hunt. And so there are 2 policy proposals that because when BAC has your meeting with the school board, there's some immediate things you can do, but it's also nice when BAC has some long range commentary. And so I'm going to put in the chat when I'm done. I'll put them in right now if my computer will allow me to do 2 things at once, but it's not been very happy lately. Okay, there it goes. So the two proposals, and both of which I think I've talked about for a while, but hopefully maybe BAC can put some support behind them. So when and I think I realized I left a word out of this policy that it was like all funds from lapse and turnover. And I want to make that part of the emphasis, because when we have closeout funds are delineated in the presentation. And I want to make clear that I'm talking about the lapse and turnover part of the funds. That by policy, I'd like to see those automatically go into the compensation reserve. And of course, the compensation reserve is not written in stone, it's written in pencil. If there are other pressing needs, they can then make the act of moving it wherever it needs to go. But by starting with that part going directly into the reserve, you have to take an action to move it somewhere else, not an action that costs money, but just that, like with savings for your 403Bs in the government side and 401Ks on the private sector, if you set it automated, it tends to do what you want it to do. The other thing is to tie the cost of living adjustment in the budget. And what I'm asking for is in the budget presentation that the superintendent brings forward, that there's an automatic COLA tied to the Social Security increase. For the first time, and maybe it's been there in past years, but on 371, we tie a particular increase in the budget to CPI. So I'm okay with that one too. I just want us to pick something, and maybe this group could have that conversation of what they think would be a good benchmark, and bring that to the board and say, may we have among the members of the BAC people who are in that side of policy that could bring a recommendation forward. And I understand that, you live by whatever we decide, and, you suffer by it too. So some years would be better than others, but if we have a starting point that we all agree on, I think it would be quite helpful in the out years of the budget and help with the planning of the budget, because you can tend to see several months in advance where a particular number is going to land, unless the trend line changes significantly. So again, I'm generally very pleased with this budget. It's been a long time coming, and I hope we can continue with this progress in the out years. If anyone would like to discuss with me the nuances and the different pages, I would be thrilled to do that with them, not during this meeting.
Thanks, Josh. Any other members of the public for comment? Okay, thank you both for. Sorry, went back on mute. Thanks both. I do have the letter that Reg was referring to, so I'll circulate that right after the meeting now that it's been made public. Okay, next item on the agenda is the February minutes. Any comments or corrections for the record on the February minutes that were distributed? All right, seeing none, do I have a motion to approve?
I'll move to approve.
Okay, and do I have a second?
Second.
All right, all those in favor, raise your hand.
I think we're good. I think we have enough.
Okay, motion carries. Minutes are approved. All right, so with that, I'd like to turn the floor over to Christina to talk from the school board's perch. Obviously, for those who have had a chance to watch the recording of the superintendent's presentation and the work session that immediately followed, not a lot of commentary, but we're early in the process. But Christina, welcome your thoughts on kind of what you see in the budget from your view, and probably more importantly, given you've been in our chair before as the BAC, some advice for some of the newer members about how to kind of think their way through this.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm going to speak relatively quickly to leave more of the floor for you all, because what I'm really excited to hear is y'all's conversation today about what you're seeing. For me, this is a very different environment than any of the budgets that I've seen. I was on the BAC for 3 years prior to joining the school board, and I have read every single budget back to, I think, fiscal year 94 or 93. But it goes quite far back that I've been versed in these budgets. And this is a this is a much better world that we are currently in. I'm excited to see this is the first budget where the superintendent was really able to show his vision for the school system. This is the first budget that was developed not only with the superintendent in place, but also his cabinet. And so we're starting to see their vision for where we're going to be going in the near future. And there's a lot of good things to see. There are a couple of holes that we've found, and I'm excited to hear from you all of like the little small things that might have been missed that we might either want to bring back or adjust or things like that. But on the whole, this is a much better budget than I think we've seen in the past, and I'm really excited to see it. My advice at this point, I did want to address some of the comments that have come up thus far about the shelf life of this plan and about our competitiveness within the region. And I really encourage folks to go to the work session that actually happened yesterday that was focused on compensation and collective bargaining. The section on this specifically was around the middle of the meeting. But we talked pretty extensively about how we are going to need, and we know that we are going to need to continuously be re-looking back at compensation. This is not going to be a one and done. We are not going to get to being in the top 3 and then be able to stay there forever, because we know that jurisdictions around us are going to be constantly moving. And so we're going to need to continuously look back at this every single time. And so I think that's going to be a productive exercise for us every single year to just make sure that we are maintaining that competitiveness, looking at different scales. There are going to be different scales that'll be more or less competitive on a particular year, depending on what the market looks like. And not just our teaching scales, but also our central office scales or our central office scales of folks who are assigned to central office, but are actually deployed in schools, like our psychologists, our social workers, our speech language pathologists, et cetera. So this is going to be an ongoing project. My advice for you all is to definitely read. I have my copy of the budget book as well, and I have notes and sticky notes scribbled throughout it. But I always found that taking the time to just sit down and read the entire thing was incredibly informative. The first several hundred pages where you have the building the budget section are certainly the most directive if you're in a hurry, but dig into those subsequent pages, look for the programs that you really care about, see what the differences are from program to program or from school to school, because it's going to give you a better understanding of what we're doing and what the purpose is of different things, and just gives you a better understanding of the budget writ large. And then really asking yourself from an equity lens of like making sure, are there voices that are missing? Are there perspectives that are missing? There were lots and lots and lots of people who did a lot of incredible work over several months on this budget. And also, we're all human. It is possible that we've missed a thing. It is possible that there's something that's not here. So raising that and bringing that to our attention earlier rather than later is really helpful. Like Chuck said, we're early on in the process, but this is a very different process than we've looked at in the past. We're not looking at those tiers of cuts and having to debate between them, which is just a really wonderful and exciting place to be in. So looking forward to listening and hearing everything that you all talk about the rest of the evening.
Any specific questions for Christina? Okay, seeing none. Yeah, and as we go throughout tonight, obviously, the goal here is really a lot of dialogue and discussion amongst us, but there are going to be points raised where we have Leslie, we have Christina, so feel free as we go through the discussion as a group, if there are questions that need to be raised, let's raise them at that time so we can sort out, figuring out what knowns are and unknowns and move from there. Before we get into the discussion, for those who sit on other committees or liaise with them, any broad comments from those committees that you want to put into the process now? Yeah, Jennifer, go ahead.
Sorry, I had to unmute. I'm actually just trying to remember. At ASAC, we had a very good conversation. That's the Special Education Advisory Committee about sort of some of the ongoing challenges in that, particularly I think autistic students are having. I think that the the staffing issues that they're facing this year. They don't really have enough staff to deal in general with the issues, and several of the staff are actually out for other personal reasons, I think. And so while there are some improvements being made in next year's budget for it, there is definitely a very strong concern that, and I think that a member, an APS staff person actually said at the meeting, the house is on fire, like, the house is on fire now, right? Like, and very much concerns about what are we going to be doing now, and that was what the parents' concerns were in that conversation. So anyway, so that's something just to sort of think about, that's on my mind as we look at this budget, both for next year, but also, what more is it that APS needs to be doing for this year, for the challenges that are there and that students are facing.
Okay. Anything else, Jennifer?
That was the primary discussion.
Okay, Michael.
Good evening, everybody. Just wanted to say, follow up with some of the comments I've made throughout the rest of our meetings. The biggest thing from the ACTL, the Teaching and Learning Committee, is you'll see it in this budget, is mostly regarding the reduction of class sizes, the implement of the middle school teams model, and the math coaches and reading coaches at the elementary schools for Title I enrollment, over 650 students. Those are some of the big things that were discussed in all of our meetings leading up to the budget process. I can provide more details about why they came to those recommendations if you would like, but just wanted to heads up, that's the highlight from most of the meetings that I attended. That's where a lot of that recommendation came in, and that's where it ended up in the budget.
Yeah, just make sure I got the different elements of that. Obviously, we had the class size reduction, the math and reading coaches. What was the third area?
It's the planning factor regarding the middle school for the teams model.
The middle school teams model, that's right. Okay.
Thank you.
And just so everyone's aware, I did invite the other advisory committees to be able to provide input to us. Obviously, their meeting schedules are a little bit different than ours. So, for some, they won't meet until the third week of March. So, we'll have to just faithfully try to sort out if we do get input from other committees, how we try to capture that in a way where we can take their expertise and focus and inform the work that we're doing. But obviously their meeting cadence is a little bit different than ours. And so, it's likely that we'll have to come to some accommodation about how we do that. But that offer was made to the different groups. So if you do sit with other advisory committees, definitely would stress if you can, let those chairs know that, we are looking for that input. Again, not sure how we'll factor it in, if we will at all, but at least I want to make sure they have the opportunity to provide us their input. And as we look across all the different areas that we're going to potentially address, making sure that at least we have as much information on our hands as possible as we step into our role in this whole in the budget process piece. Okay, so with that, what I'd like to do now is kind of shift gears and really, no format or anything of that nature, but this is really our opportunity. Bit of a blank slate to be able to talk about our individual views about what we have seen in the budget, what our concerns are, what things are we comfortable with, really without any judgment or sort of preconditions about we have to focus in this direction or this. As Christina alluded to earlier, the last couple of years we've not had that luxury. The last couple of years, we have faced significant cuts, and we have immediately had to focus on just making the books balance and figuring out how to prioritize those different cuts to make sure that we arrived at a balanced budget by the time it was submitted to the board for approval, or before the board approves it. we're not in that environment this year. This year, the makeup of this budget is very different, and I do echo that it's good to see the strategic direction that the superintendent intends to take APS. I think this budget reflects some of that thinking. I don't know if it's all this year. Obviously, things have to be phased in, but you're starting to get a clear direction of where Dr. Duran views APS and the ways in which we can grow and improve as a system. So I think it's good to be able to finally be in a fiscal environment where we can actually have those discussions about investments rather than what things do we have to cut just to make ends meet. So I would say personally, just from the last few years of experience, this is a much more welcome place to be. But with that, I'm going to go last because I don't want, I would like to hear from everyone first, your views. And, the way I think we'll do that is if, go ahead and just, raise your hands, and then I'll just kind of look at the order in which I see them on my screen. And again, you really just want to hear your thoughts about what you see, how you feel about it, what things didn't you see that maybe you want to see, or hey, we probably ought to look a little bit harder at this, or can we get some more information about this particular aspect of the budget? Whatever it is you feel you need to do to help you as an individual properly evaluate the budget, and then. I'll give you my thoughts at the end of what I felt, and then Leslie will talk through the budget question process, which is important for everyone to understand how that's going to work, so that as the school board and the APS staff have their back and forth about different questions of the budget, it's a way to just keep pace of those questions and answer some of the things that are common, or insights that maybe we didn't think about, and then talk about what our next meeting will look like on the 16th. But see a few hands up. So what we'll do is Eric, we'll go Eric, Catherine, and then Bridget, and then after that, we'll just keep rolling through. So Eric, go ahead.
Okay, yeah, thanks. So first, I do want to echo that I think it's for folks who have been on the committee now for several years, it is kind of refreshing to be able to actually do what many of us want to do. What we wanted to do when we joined the committee was to help try and figure out how do we get the APS into a long-term sustainable structure that is financially viable, on an ongoing basis. And we haven't had the opportunity to do that for a variety of reasons. And to Chuck's point and Christina's point, have been focused more on year in. How do we balance this budget this year? What may need to be set aside? What are our priorities, et cetera? So having the extra dollars this year, I think, is fantastic, and I think it's a great opportunity to kind of push forward some of the things we've had to set aside, which is again great. And again, it gives us the opportunity to look ahead and say, how do we, help our kids now, but also set them up for continued increasing support over time. With that, I think one of the things for tonight one of the objectives for tonight really should be to kind of get some common themes that we can bring to the board. Some of those might be kind of micro level themes around here are some things that we think we should be spending a little more on because we're underfunding them. Maybe some things that maybe we need to consider spending a little less on. And that's fine. I think those are all important to get in there. But I think one of the things that popped out to me in this budget was related to sustainability. Is this a budget that over time is sustainable? Some of the increases we have planned this year are needed and large. And the question is, in my mind, do we need to do them all at once, or do we step them in? Because right now, from a sustainability perspective, it looks like we could be setting ourselves up to be digging a hole that only gets deeper over time. But if we do it the right way, we can do it in a way that we can continually have a truly balanced budget over time. And by balanced budget, I mean, where our revenues and our expenditures increase, and we're not solely relying on, budgeting techniques or taking surplus out of our reserve or taking reserves to cover shortfalls, that we do put ourselves in a place where, you know, each year that our expenditures and our revenues are more closely aligned. And in fact, that's, you know, one of the directives from the board to the superintendent in you know, that summary section, which provides direction to the superintendent, is to look at the sustainability. And so when I start looking at the budget forecasts, you know, in slides pages 70 through 74 maybe or something, what I see is kind of an increasing deficit, and I think that's where we start to look at getting into trouble over the long term. I think to kind of counter that, and it's not to say that we shouldn't be doing some of the things that are proposed in the budget, but we may need to look at stepping them in, putting some steps in place to do them over a period of time. Now, I'm not sure what that period of time is yet, and I'm not sure how we prioritize those, but I think it would probably make sense for us as a group to look at maybe some different options where we would be able to look and say, you know, if we did this, broke things out in thirds and did it over a course of a number of years, or if we focused on some higher priority things first and priority 2 things second, and we roll those out, that we could actually look and evaluate kind of the flow, the financial flow, of the impact of starting to phase some of these things in versus doing everything in a big bang in 1 year. So I mean, that's kind of what I took. I mean, obviously all very positive. Again, having the additional funds from the county, the additional funds available to spend helps us to do things that we haven't been able to do. I just want to make sure we do it in a prudent way, that we don't set ourselves up for coming back to where we were in 2 years and saying, okay, now we have a shortfall and now we got to go back and start cutting again. So that's my take.
Okay, thank you, Eric. Catherine.
Okay, well, I wanted to raise my hand and speak early on because I think that we have a lot of the same themes, because it is, you know, just notably, wow, a different situation. And I appreciate how Christina talked about the, you know, privilege that it is to be working in this environment now. But I think some of the things that we'll have to be prepared to explain to our, you know, friends and, you know, people we know in other organizations and such is the surge in the cost per student. And I know that, you know, we in Arlington, just by being a smaller school division, you know, there's certain fixed costs that kind of add up and don't necessarily mean that there's, you know, a lot more resources per student. By being small, we're going to have higher fixed basis. That's true. But now that if we compare the enrollment from last year, there's a slight increase in enrollment and yet a huge, you know, jump in the cost per student, $2,800. It's more than 13%. And I know that the compensation is going to be an important part of that, but what else is there? I mean, that 13% is, you know, to anyone else who is, you know, federal employees are getting what, 5% and, you know, things like that. So, and I know that we're starting from a place behind, but we need to be able to have a story to tell about why it's needed. And to Eric's point, you know, are there aspects of it that can be phased in, because that's just like a really, you know, big number all at once. And I think that we need to, it was mentioned early on that to compare it to neighboring divisions. And, you know, I know that, you know, you look at the total, at the compensation parity and all that, but that cost per student is something that really fixes in people's head, and we need to get a better story about that. And then on the point of compensation, you know, that was also mentioned. It's barely keeping up, or even not keeping up in top 3. So, wow, you know, how is that going to play out in recruitment and retention? And I think we should just have a little more discussion on that. If it's way better than nothing, obviously, but is it enough? You know, it's a kind of force that goes both ways. It's not enough or it's too much. And then another thing that comes along with that compensation is associated other costs, such as pension and so forth. And so that is something, you know, somebody that's hired now is going to have that much more pension, you know, pay in every year and then pay out in 30 years from now. So not just the price tag, but any other associated costs with that. And then another point that I wanted us to think about is this one-time cost. And I was thinking a lot about one-time, pandemic money that we saw last year, for specific things, sanitizing and air filtering and such. And then we have that 12 million revenue from the county. I think it's important for us to take a stand that whatever is being funded by one-time revenue is a one-time expense, because if we're building in a reliance on one-time revenue for something that is going to be a recurring expense, that's the hole that Eric was mentioning for the future. Going into a future where there will inevitably be higher costs, and we have in the past relied on one-time pay-in for that, then it's like a double trouble in the future. So let us sort out the one-time revenues and one-time expenses and try to match them up, and to really see that the ongoing expenses have ongoing revenues matched to them. And then the second to last point that I wanted to discuss was about the depletion of revenues, of reserves, and considering, the very healthy revenue situation. It's like, okay, how much of those reserves are being proposed, 3.7 million, how does that rack up to how much other reserves there are, and what should the reserves be for? What's a prudent amount of the reserves that we should, advocate that be maintained? And then just the last point, and I think I bug Leslie about this every year, the debt service, again, we're talking about increasing interest environment. And although the county places the debt, I did notice it's, up over 8% now. And so even if it's within the, it's within the envelope that is fine for, keeping the bond ratings and all those other good finance aspects, it's like, that's 8% of the money that could be used for something else. So that's just something to keep an eye on, and to maintain a position, an eye on it, particularly if the cost of that debt is going to go up. So those were my initial observations, and I think I feel a little vindicated because we've had some similar discussion. I don't think I have anything particularly original, and I think it just shows the importance of some of these points.
Okay. No, thank you, Catherine. Bridget.
Hi, everybody. I first need to start by saying that I'm new to the committee, so I don't have the benefit of really digging in and understanding what happened in previous years, or what the reserves were and the deficits were and that sort of thing. I was strictly looking at the budget I have before me and other county initiatives that I'm involved in, have done work in, and very passionate about. And I was reading through this budget, and I saw that Arlington was boasting having their high schools, 3 of their high schools, in the top 2% ranking in the nation: Yorktown, Washington Lee, and HB. So when I went through and looked at each school, I was very troubled by what I saw, quite frankly. Looking at the cost per staff, there was a direct relationship between the number of non-white students to the cost per staff. And the lowest ranking schools with the highest non-white students have the lowest costs. So I don't know if this is something you all have dealt with in the past, if this is an improvement over the past, but it's quite abysmal. I'm looking at Randolph, Drew, Hoffman, Boston, and Wakefield as having the lowest cost per staff in their school type and the highest non-white population. And then I look further and I see that the highest cost per staff is with the 3 high schools that made the ranking. And then I went to the board's priorities, which were ensure student well-being, advance the goals of equity. I don't think those things need to be mutually exclusive. I don't think we need to do one at the detriment of the other. And I'm looking at the missing middle study, the multifamily reinvestment study, 2 studies that I am personally involved in, the zoning ordinance, APS's racial segregation. I mean, the list goes on and on. Restorative justice, which I'm a part of. All of these things point me in the same direction. We do a lot of talking about what is important for Arlington in policy, but when it comes down to doing real substantive work, we're lacking in funding, real support, and initiatives that really have teeth to make these things happen. So looking at these numbers, in good faith, I can't say that this is a good budget. And if anyone wants to talk with me more about this offline, I'm happy to do that. But based on what I see, it's just not there. And then I'm looking at the new positions for equity and inclusion at Yorktown and HB, the schools with the lowest non-white populations, and yet the highest ranking. And then I look at gifted services, which is getting more money than the DEI office per cost per staff. The numbers don't add up to me. Everywhere I looked, and when I started this process, it was blind. I just took the numbers, ranked everything as I saw them, hoping for a different picture with what I saw on this committee. And quite frankly, I was very discouraged. And this is something that I would like to talk further about. I don't think we have enough time here to do it, but there are some other disparities that I see that are troubling related to transportation safety in schools, housing in schools, et cetera. But I'll leave it at that.
No, thank you, Bridget. Jennifer Wheelock.
Sorry about that. Bridget, thank you first of all for that really that view and those thoughts on this. And would love to sort of talk with you further about other things you see too, and have further conversations on that. I think to sort of step back again, I'm also sort of new here this year too, and the bias sort of I bring to this work, I mean, is that, I have a daughter who's in 3rd grade, who's dyslexic, who was in 1st grade when the pandemic broke out, and have since gotten more involved in APS because of our experiences, right? As many parents sort of do. And so I think, I have like two kind of, one side, on the one hand, on the other hand, sort of things. My first view is that there can be probably no greater priority for APS in the next 1 to 2 years than supporting student recovery. And by that, we're talking about learning loss recovery. I'm talking about social emotional, and I'm talking about sort of the students who might have trauma from other things related to the pandemic. And I recognize that was sort of the first priority, generally the first priority, if not maybe that narrowly focused for the budget direction. And I'll have a few further comments on that. On the flip side of that, though, I also sort of see, like Eric, the sustainability problems, concerns that are there too, and so likewise have kind of questions. Okay, how are we going to sort of be in a better, not have ourselves in the wrong place in 2 to 3 years, with some of the structural sort of issues here. But to kind of go back to maybe the first sort of category of things, is, I was really happy to see things like the class size decreases. I was happy to see some of the special education investments, which are badly needed. I was happy to see, I'm happy to see that we're continuing to make sort of curriculum investments in addition to the one-time expenditures that were used with this past year's closeout funds. There's some additional items in there. I would like to see, I am concerned that, unless I've missed it in the budget, is perhaps what I might call like COVID contingencies. I'm a little, and this is something we talked about at a previous meeting where I've had questions about it. What are we building in? Are we building? I know that we are addressing the budget addresses some filtration, replacing air purifiers, some things like that, and dealing with some things of that nature. I am concerned about whether or not would like to see us make a commitment to those staff and students who want KN95s, that they will have access to them. I think that's something that APS should be providing. I will note again that within the special education community, those students who are asking for accommodations because they are at greater risk with coronavirus, they're giving being given filters to put inside their masks. They're not being given KN95s. They're being given filters to put inside their masks. We should, that is something that if a child requests that through their IEP or their 504, that's something, a proper mask, a better mask, it seems to me a reasonable accommodation. And likewise for those staff who would be protected under ADA should have access to that. So I'd like to really see a commitment to some COVID contingencies, masks, tests, who knows what we can anticipate that probably there'll be a surge next winter. Will it be a new variant? Will it be detectable with the rapid tests? Who knows? So I'd like to see us making sure that we have something set aside thinking about the unknowns that next year might still bring. I very much appreciate Reg's comments at the beginning of this. And again, on the student support recovery, getting to this, that one-time funds should be used for one-time things. And I would put firmly in that category of we should be offering and expanding and ramping up before and after school tutoring for those students who need it. This next month, we're going to be seeing more from APS on the learning losses that our students have faced. And there'll be a dashboard coming out, as I understand, on that as well. And I think that we're going to need to devote more resources somehow to addressing the really strong challenges. And again, to sort of bridge some comments too, I know that some of the schools with the greatest learning loss, like the widening gap is really at Randolph, Drew, Hoffman, Boston, at least at the elementary level, and Barcroft, I believe. They have some of the greatest sort of gaps, whereas like the gap, and that's when I say gap, I mean looking at like 2019 to 2020, based on the SOLs, and as opposed to like it's just phenomenal, the learning loss that those students experienced, and much smaller when you compare that to the learning loss that students at our wealthiest schools experienced. The gap is really astronomical, and we're just not doing enough to address it. Certainly not doing enough this year, and I'm really concerned that we're not seeing the things in the budget for next year. And I believe that those, I think that some of that could truly be one-time expenses. And let's see. Oh, I have such terrible handwriting, I can't read my notes. I think those are my primary points. Oh, and I guess, and then I do have a question for you, Chuck, quickly is, will we have additional chances to send in questions to you to filter to Leslie and the staff, because I need to get some to you. Thank you.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And we'll talk about that when we get to the budget question process. So I think, as that evolves with, the back and forth that will go between, the board and the APS staff, I think just being mindful that APS's staff's priority will be to answer board questions first, and then obviously if time available, they'll, help us, but obviously we'll glean what we can, and then where we have gaps, we can certainly filter up those to Leslie. Okay. Other members who have not weighed in yet. Jen Wegner.
Okay, sorry, I've been driving, so I was hoping to find a moment where I was stationary. So definitely agree with many of the comments that have already been shared. I'll try to touch on a few different ones. So ongoing investment in special ed and English learning, great to see. We've been investing a lot in those areas the last number of years. It continues to make you ask the question, are we still that far behind? How much more do we have to go? Or is maybe the model that we're using for this not working? I think we've talked about this in the committee before, but that certainly, again, happy to see the investment, but just wondering how much more we have left. There definitely were some numbers about growth in students in those categories. Haven't had the chance to look at it in super detail, but suspect that it's a combination of growth of students in those categories, but also just ongoing underinvestment in the past. From a great that we don't have a list of cuts to go through, but hoping that there definitely were still those exercises because, as we've all discussed, are we going to end up in a year or 2 years from now having to cut all this stuff out again? So, we've talked about things like transportation, the option schools. There's kind of our list of 3 or 4 big ticket items. Were those addressed in here at all? Or did we just not have to really deal with them this year? I know that there's the study on the bell schedules, which should have a very positive impact on transportation. Are we going to get the benefit of that in next year's budget if data comes out in time? And then the other thing that struck me was just the great amount of money we got from the county. It struck me that I was interested in how of the total amount that we're getting from the county, how does that compare to past years? Is this the greatest amount we've ever got? And therefore, is it going to be a sustainable number, the 12 million one time aside? Great that it's there, but is it going to be there next year and the year after? What do we sort of expect the county revenues to do over the next 3 years? And is that going to become a risk area for us?
Okay. Next. Never professionally educated, but happy to call on folks if they're not willing. All right, well, while we have this gap in folks' thoughts, let me chime in with a couple of things that, oh, Melanie, go ahead. There you go.
I'm trying to come off mute. Sorry. I'm having a little bit of system difficulty tonight. I think I have too many PowerPoints open. Apologies that I was a little late to the meeting. Juggling a few things this evening. So, I mean, I guess this comes with not speaking first. So, Catherine, you were smart to go first. Although I really appreciated Bridget's point of view and bringing some new topics to discussion. Bridget, thank you. For your comments and for bringing in additional point of view to the committee. I have been on the committee for a few years. I've seen everywhere from the first year I think my first year we did not have huge budget deficits, or maybe it was just the first year I read the budget, and maybe the first year I wasn't on BAC, but we've had some very big budget deficits since I have been actively involved in the BAC. It was definitely nice to see one which didn't start with tiered cuts. And also one that was really nice to see the type of investments that we saw in this budget around DEI, around English language learning, around special ed, around class size. I mean, the list goes on, and I think there's a lot to be pleased about. Although I will say, Bridget, your comments were very helpful, because it's nice to hear the headlines about what we're investing in. And as I went through the priorities and read the pages myself, I was thinking, are these exactly the right things to be investing in each one of these areas? And I think that there's definitely a lot more discussion that can be had around your comments around, are we picking the right areas to invest in to meet those headlines and to get the results that we want? So thank you for bringing that. And I think we should discuss further around those topics. But I will say, I also, and maybe it is because I've been on the committee the last few years, and because I did push for or encourage the board to include the financial sustainability recommendation in the guidelines for this year's budget. I was concerned, or I am concerned, that we are balancing the budget with so much of our reserves, or over about $26 million of reserves, in addition to the one-time funds. And I am just really concerned that this year's budget does not contain a robust 3-year forecast. It does have a projection that we will start with a deficit next year of $32.4 million. And true, we started this year with a deficit and we were able to make that up, but I think we made it up with one-time funds and reserves. And I think we have to be careful that we don't invest in a lot all at once. In the same year, we're investing in a large increase in salaries for our staff, which I think is really important, and then come back next year with a whole series of cuts. And if we do that for the next couple of years, we are going to run out of those reserves that we that we have relied on for the last couple of years or last few years to help bridge the gaps. And I am worried about that. I don't think we're out of the woods with COVID and other economic insecurities. Look what's happening in the world right now, and look what's happening to gas prices and the price of commodities. And we don't know what's going to happen in the next year or two. And I don't think we can spend up all our reserves in one place at one time. And I would love to be able to invest in all this at once, assuming we're investing in the right things. And I think we do want to reserve some time to talk about exactly the things that Bridget has brought up, because if we spend our money, we want to spend it in the right places. But I am concerned about the financial sustainability. And I think we do need to make sure that we are looking at that longer term before we commit too many reserves to balance this year's budget. Thank you, Chuck.
Thank you, Melanie. Next. All right, I'll go ahead and chime in, and then hopefully that will offer others the opportunity to come forward and share your thoughts. Without rehashing many of the comments those have already gone before have raised, a couple of thoughts or ideas about sort of the way ahead on this budget and looking ahead the next few years. I think the first is and we have gone down this road in the past with finding appropriate metrics or measurables for some of the things that we spend our budget toward, and how that can inform performance or help us perhaps more in a targeted fashion address gaps, investments, opportunities, however you want to frame that. But I think one area where this immediately jumps to mind, and appreciate Bridget bringing it up, is we look at our gaps in terms of achievement, and that's been a consistent theme over the last few years about depending on where a school is situated within a county, how where they kind of fall above or below that sort of baseline of achievement. Are we is the budget this year sort of taking a spread the wealth sort of idea across the board, or can we take those same investments and perhaps spend more in some areas and perhaps spend less in others in a much more targeted fashion, where we are surging resources where we need to, where the need demands it, and perhaps slowing the investment for other schools that may not need the help right away. Recognizing that there is a learning loss across the board, but obviously that loss is not uniform. So should we look at, perhaps, without decreasing or increasing spending in the aggregate, but do we more effectively focus some of our resources on areas where we know we have far more loss than others? So are there some measurables or metrics that we can employ or look at that are readily available to us that can help us address that? My second thought was, when we tie in the enrollment projection and we look at this budget, which did assume a fall off in our overall enrollment, just in a de facto kind of way, we've organically reduced class size by virtue of doing that. Is there a need then in the short term to further reduce the class size, or is the need great enough to not just reduce class size based on the attrition of students out of APS, either to other jurisdictions to private school, whatever, or is the investment needed to increase the amount of teachers we have and further reduce the class size beyond that of the attrition that we have projected within this budget? So that's sort of my second sort of broader question is related to that. And probably something I think, for Leslie to help inform us as we look at this tussle of trade-offs is, if we look at how, there's a lot of upfront work in the budget in various areas of investment, compensation, et cetera. But if we were to look at phased approaches to building some of those investments in over time, as opposed to an upfront, taking the upfront costs now this year, really the question for you, Leslie, would be how easily done is that, where we could see like, okay, if we took investment X and instead of doing it all this year, if we maybe did it 50-50, are there some easy ways where we can see that kind of trade-off, just from your perch, looking at some of the future budgets, how easily would that be done, and what degree of work will we need to be able to look at, if we asked for some analysis on phasing in an approach as opposed to paying for it all now, what kind of work might have to be done to support helping us understand that? So I guess that question is to you, Leslie.
Sorry, I didn't think I was going to have to answer right away. The first thing I will say is that there are a lot of unfunded requests that didn't make it to this budget. And a lot of those requests, we did exactly that. We said, okay, you want 3 behavior specialists. How about 1? And that's what we did. So we've done a lot of that phasing aspect already. You might be able to find some initiatives that are in the budget that you could look at and say, okay, let's try to phase this in. Thank you. My dessert was just delivered. Sorry for the noise. But I struggle because I'm thinking about some of the higher cost items, some of the things that we put more money into, compensation being, the first and foremost, and don't see any way that we could actually phase that in. We need to do it all, and we need to do it all right now. Some of the special education initiatives, we don't have an opportunity to phase some of those in. We need what we have asked for, we need it, and we need it right now. Others, perhaps they could be phased in. And I pick on special education because they did have, a substantial new investment in this budget, more than some others. Could we phase in reducing class size? Yes, we could. Elementary, we're phasing in, we're reducing class size by 2. Could we do it by 1? Yes. But we did, when I tell you that we've already done that, that phasing in aspect, we had over $17 million worth of requests from academics that there's no way we could have put through, right? So we put in the things that were of the utmost priority versus some others. I want to also speak to your point, Chuck, about de facto class sizes being small, and the reality is that's not the case. You may recall last May that the school board increased class size by 1 on the night of adoption. And that put some class sizes at like 30. at the elementary school. And I think their rationale was, well, we're not going to have, students aren't going to come in, so class sizes aren't going to be that big. But as it happens every year, class sizes don't come in exactly as we project them, because we project down to the grade level, and it didn't come in that way. So there were a number of classes, because we budgeted to the maximum class size. Maximum class size is 30. We budget the number of teachers that requires class sizes to be 30. In some schools that happens, in some schools it doesn't, depending on how many students there are. It just depends on how that falls out. But there were a number of classes that were at those very high maximums, and we ended up having to put additional staff into there to reduce that. So it didn't actually play out that way, and it wouldn't play out that way for next year either, because we've taken all that staff out of the budget. All that, kind of excess staff that you might consider, we took it all out before we put in the reduced class size and the middle school planning factor change and the reduced class at high school. We budgeted this year based on the actual new enrollment projections, which are much, much lower than what was in the budget this year. So we actually saved almost $10 million from doing that. That we used then to help reduce class size. I hope that helps.
Yes. No, thank you. Appreciate that. Those were my immediate thoughts. Turn the floor over to others who haven't had an opportunity to provide their comment or feedback. Yeah, Andy.
Hi. So thank you for the opportunity. I don't want to also, like you said, Chuck, kind of rehash some of the things already been said, but I think I'm in agreement with a lot of, or not everything that people have said so far. I think it's definitely important to consider all the schools that have a below average, if you will, funding levels, or a lower level of funding when you start considering the demographics. I would like to see that applied also to the option schools, to see how those funding levels pair out for especially the immersion schools and Montessori. Montessori has 2/3 of its seats reserved for people who make below the median income level in Arlington, which can influence the demographics at various locations, not just at MPSA. And the pre-pandemic levels of Montessori enrollment and applications were very high, and because of the changes to, in part, of course, to some of those changes that we saw during the pandemic with going to virtual, a lot of parents pulled people out when they had to pay a tuition for a public school at the Montessori level. So I think it's important to consider that when considering at least that program. While we're talking about the Montessori, the MPSA, I think the planning factors should be addressed for staffing, so that it can address paraprofessionals. I know that community, when it was at Drew, moving over to MPSA, lost some of the extras, if you will. The Spanish teacher and art teacher were budgeted for, and changed them so that they could pursue a level of certification, which requires an aide or an assistant teacher in the class, along with a certified Montessori teacher. So, I mean, the idea in trying to talk about the option schools writ large is it's not just a geographic issue for funding. Some of the option programs like the Immersion and Montessori have just a very interesting demographic slice of Arlington County. I think if I could foot stomp anything, it would also be the learning loss with equity in mind. I think, anyone with a smaller or a lower elementary aged child saw that their kid is not, it's certainly true in our house, is not where they should be with that social, not just the measurable metrics like reading levels and math progress and all that kind of things, but also the socio-emotional development and being able to, process things and speech development at reading level. There's lots of different ways to look at it, and I encourage us all to consider them. And that's about all I have. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you, Andy. Others? Based on some of the commentary already, does anyone have questions of others who've already spoken? Particularly, any areas that came up that sort of piqued your interest, or want to provide some greater context or perspective to something one of the other members has brought up already? Sal, go ahead.
Hey, Chuck. Actually, it's a sort of a pickup on a theme. I don't know if you covered it that much in your comments, but around kind of key performance indicators, and really kind of resonated with me when I was reading some of the budget items that were intended to be put in place for operational improvement and best practices. Admittedly, I didn't get all the way to the back of the budget, so if there's further discussion about that and presentation of what those benchmarks are, and I, shame on me, I'll get to it, but I would love to understand further and generally how the school performs, not just on spending per student, but on other sort of operational measures. And again, just besides tests and performance and all that, I want to understand more about how do you spend money to save money, which I think is an important virtue. And also, again, I need to get later, get deeper into the back of the budget about the sort of spending, distribution amongst the schools. It's near and dear to my heart to ensure that the schools and the students that need the resources get it ahead of the students that don't. Others may disagree with that. That's just how I feel. And I always like to understand how those decisions are made and what constraints are placed on those decisions as they're being made. That's my 2 cents here.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. I know, and then I'll turn the floor over to Jennifer. But I know on one of the earlier discussions we have, some of the operational efficiency stuff with respect to, I don't know if it's quite the right words, but some of the human resource modernization, going to the Oracle suite, some of the other investments that are being made now, but how that will hopefully help in the future with some of the, sort of the back office work that we know has to go on to administer the system. But I know there were some investments made in this budget that hopefully will point to some of those efficiencies into the future. But yeah, certainly some others that may be a bit more elusive. And I think this is something that we've wrestled with definitely over time with how do we evaluate when an investment isn't performing, and the decision to then disinvest for something that just quite frankly isn't working, and the willingness to do so. So yeah, definitely would welcome thoughts on that. Jennifer?
Yeah, I just wanted to since you opened it up, I'll just meant to ask questions of each other or pose questions here. The question I put in the chat, I was kind of curious, Leslie, as you were discussing sort of the difference between like what we budget for and then, like what we actually see happen in the classrooms, based on those enrollment forecasts. And I guess I'm just sort of wondering if in particular this year or maybe years in general, but particularly this year, between the planning factors increasing and the enrollment trends, if in my sense, and this is what I'd like to have corrected if it's not correct, is that we might see on average larger class sizes in our South Arlington schools than we're seeing in our North Arlington schools, and particularly I'm looking at the elementary level. And I'm guessing it can probably get to some of that. And if that is true, I suspect it could get a little bit to that nuance you were talking about. And I think again, South Arlington schools I do think are just generally more heavily at a higher utilization of their capacity than North Arlington schools, but I could be wrong on some of those. So it's a chance for you to correct me or steer me in the right direction.
I have no idea. I really don't know. I don't look at whether or not a school is a South Arlington school or North Arlington school when we're going through and figuring out what schools need more teachers because they've, hit that maximum class size. I honestly have no idea.
Got it. I live in South Arlington, so that's why I'm sort of generally aware that like the South Arlington schools in general are that's where the kids are at, right? And that's and that's one of the challenges I think that we've been dealing with in boundary processes and these kinds of things too. So anyhow, I can go and look at some of the average class size data for the schools. Thank you.
Yeah, sure.
Other questions for other members of the BAC in terms of discussion that's been had thus far? So one question I'd like to pose to the group, were there any investments that were not made that you would have expected to see? Did anyone notice anything in that? And if you haven't yet, because you're just trying to absorb a very voluminous object, that's fine. But did anyone see investments that perhaps should have been made that they did not see? Any thoughts around that?
I should raise my hand.
Yeah, no, go ahead, Bridget.
Okay, I sort of said this in a roundabout way, I suppose, but I certainly would like to see, I did not see it, an investment in staff salaries in the schools that have the lower performances and that currently have the lower staff rates in salary. And I wanted to answer, I think it was Andy who asked the question about Montessori. I looked at all of the schools, Andy, and Montessori fell in the middle of all of the schools that I looked at. And what my concern really is that, Leslie, to your point, I don't think staff is looking enough at how different schools' demographics affect the outcomes simply because, based on our priorities, simply because of the demographics. I think that there should be a lot more emphasis placed on that because historically, everything that, and I'm going to step back for a second. I lived for a very long time in the Bluemont community, and I've recently moved to South Arlington. So I've looked at schools all over, and my son is now in high school. I have seen a drastic difference in how students are taught and how schools are funded. So I would really like to see staff, teachers look more at demographics and how those things play out. I just don't see it happening. So to the extent that we can invest more in teachers that are at these schools would be greatly appreciated. And that's all I have to say.
I'm sorry, I just want to clarify a couple of things. When you say invest more in the teachers that teach at those schools, what exactly do you mean by that?
When I look at per staff, the cost per staff, there is a lower rate that teachers are being paid at the schools that I mentioned than they are at Jamestown, Nottingham, Tuckahoe, Cardinal, Discovery, and Williamsburg.
Right. And the reason for that difference is the experience of the teachers.
Okay.
If a teacher comes in and they're a first, second, third, fourth, fifth year teacher, they're going to be paid less than if they're a 10, 11, 12, 13-year teacher.
Okay. That
accounts for the majority of the difference that you see across schools when you're looking at salaries, is the experience of the teacher and where they are on the salary scale. That's it. I'm not saying that, I mean, we could look at it and say, well, then we need to put more experienced teachers at these schools. Hey, an argument for me on that.
Read my mind.
But it's not because we're not paying those teachers the same as we're paying every other teacher in Arlington. They come in, they get put on the salary scale, they get paid for where they are in their level of experience with teaching. So that's where you're going to find a large difference. Could we make that change to making sure that we have more experienced teachers at those schools? I'm sure that we could. That's not for me to say. Shoot, I was going somewhere else and I forgot.
I do that all the time. Let me just say this, though. The way I have seen equity defined is also troubling. Equity to me is giving most to people who have generally received the least. So in that regard, I've seen a lot of definitions in the budget and in other places that say giving everybody equal access. That to me is just equality. Equity is really making up for these differences that have happened over a long period of time. And so in that regard, I still am in full support of teachers and even students for that matter, receiving more in the schools that have the lower scores and are at the bottom.
Right. So, and our planning factors don't really, they do in some cases, but they don't really take that into account. So we don't have additional planning factors for schools that might have, a larger percentage of EL students or a larger percentage of special education students or a larger percentage of students who are economically disadvantaged. We don't have that. I do know that one of our school board members was working on a project around that. I don't know where he is on that, but I know it's something that he wants to introduce to the superintendent at some point in the future, and that does take some of that into account. And that's fine with me. I'm happy to do that. It will cost more, of course. So that's something to keep in mind. Not that we shouldn't invest those funds, but everything does cost. So got to figure out what's going to be the first priority and the second priority and the third priority.
They've already laid out equities number 2, so they have those.
Equity is the second one. Yes, it's not number 2. They're not prioritized. They're just 4 bullets.
Gotcha.
Although I shouldn't speak. I should ask Christina, because I'm assuming that those are just the 4 and that they're in no particular order. So Ms. Diaz Torres, would you like to correct me?
You are absolutely correct that they are not, the order is meant to be a formatting and not an actual prioritization. And also to the point on the planning factors, that's something that's been a long-standing conversation of needing to go back and look back at our planning factors and figure out how we need to bring them into a new era, given that we just think about student need very differently than when the planning factors were originally conceptualized. And they're updated every single year, but we need to take a look at them. There is a little bit of money for budget study this year that we might use towards that. So TBD. There's been a lot of interest and like more work is going to be happening on that front.
Yeah, and if we're gonna take on a study of our planning factors like that, I would highly recommend that we fund it using those funds and getting some outside help, because it took us like 3 months just to do the middle school model planning factor. Using existing staff, and it was hard. And if we're going to be looking at a lot of different planning factors at the same time, there's no way that we could do that on our own.
Yeah, this is going to be like the compensation study, that it was a multi-year investment. It took us lots of hard work from staff with the consultant to figure out what this is going to be. But yes, we see the same things, and it's just as concerning, and it's going to take us a little bit to fix it.
Before I turn over to Zach, Christina, for you, I know Reed had, this has kind of been, I think, probably year or two now. I know he actually sat with us the last go around with respect to the equity funding model for, it's a different way to budget. This is, I think, year number 2 where he's kind of been grinding on this problem. Any sense of where he may be, or I guess maybe, a chance to invite him just to come talk to us about maybe his thoughts on, if we looked at, obviously there's a baseline level of planning factors that have to be in place no matter what you do, whether you factor equity in or not. I mean, there's class sizes and things like that do have to be addressed. But then you talk about maybe what Reed was looking at, where there are some planning factors that kind of smooth out some of those gaps, right, to address, those things. I'll send Reed an invitation, but I think as a group, it may be worth giving Reed a little bit of time to kind of talk through what he's been working on over the last couple of years on this question of, more of an equity-based funding model for the schools, as opposed to, something right now which is more, planning factor-based. Particularly to get around some of these questions with achievement gaps and things of that nature, it may be worth, offering Reed, some time upcoming to discuss some ideas he has, and are those some ideas that we could explore in our report back to the school board?
I will confess that in the 17 million conversations I've had with my colleague Reed Goldstein, I have not had this particular conversation as of late. So I do not actually know where he is in this process, but strongly encourage you all to do that. This is also, his project is also part of it fills or follows kind of a national trend of more jurisdictions, whether they be states or districts or any other kind of like entity that is controlling school funding, really thinking about this. The Kerwin Commission in Maryland did this at a state level. And we've seen the outcomes of that, and like the changes to their funding model that they are still in the process of figuring out how they're going to fund, but like that is the work that is happening now. You've seen this at district levels in Colorado and in California and in other major metropolitan areas as well. So like this is not unique to us. This is the challenge that lots of people have taken on. And I know that this is part of the UNAM fellowship that he is a member of. I think he might not be quite in his second year. He might still be in his first year, just based on like when the timing of when it started. And I do not actually know. The last I spoke to him about this was months ago. It must have been in the early fall. So I don't actually know what his progress is at this point. So strongly encourage sending him an email, seeing where he's at, and seeing if he could come in and talk to you about where he's at.
Yeah, no, I think that would be good. If anything, just, from the work he is doing, there may be some ideas that, you know, could generate some discussion with respect to this issue. All right, Zach, from the student perspective.
Yeah, so I'd noticed two things. So first of all, in regards to technology, I saw that we're adding a new analyst to train school staff and technology coordinators at each of the 3 high schools. Kind of based on my experience in talking to teachers, I mean, Josh might be able to speak to this more. They seem to be in 1,000 places at once. And I don't think they're really able to fulfill their mission of really educating teachers on how to use the technology in an effective way. I think most of the time they're just there to solve problems, which I think kind of undermines the reason that they're there. Additionally, I saw that we're not reinstating professional development. Specifically in regards to the technology question, I think it's important that we have that because I see a lot of teachers not utilizing the technology to the fullest extent. But that might be due to the DOJ settlement. I don't know if we're decreasing it because of that. I don't know if Leslie, you want to talk to that more.
Sorry, I have absolutely no knowledge about that. That's out of my.
Weren't we increased it? Don't we have like mandated professional development because of the like special education DOJ settlement? Or is that already passed?
Yes, we do have that. Yeah. And
so
we have.
So it's just separate.
We put money in for that. Yes.
Okay. So this is just like extra professional development that can be for other uses. I saw it was it said it was a cut that was not reinstated from last year.
I don't remember that one. We put $100,000 in specifically for training, professional development for EL teachers and secondary teachers.
Okay.
That's specifically around that DOJ settlement agreement.
Okay. But does the professional development go beyond that? Or is it specifically just for that purpose?
It's that and other EL, around EL, but it's EL specific.
Okay. Yeah, I think it would be my recommendation that we kind of expand that to include other uses, both maybe kind of in teaching students and utilization of the technology.
Okay, thank you. See if anyone else had their hand up. Thought I saw a hand shoot up earlier and then came back down. Yeah, Bridget, go ahead.
It was me, Chuck. I was going to ask Christina about the Unum project. I think maybe she's talking about E Pluribus Unum with Mayor Landrieu from New Orleans. Is that the same project? Because he has a huge initiative right now.
I believe that is in fact the case.
Okay, that's a great project.
Yeah, that's correct.
I'm excited to hear that.
Yes, it sounds like the general consensus is yes. I was not 100% sure.
Okay.
Yeah, no, I worked with Reed on that. So yeah, that's what it is.
Okay. Last call for any members of the group who have not had an opportunity to speak. Okay, you'll be the first speakers next week. Okay. There were a few questions that were submitted to Leslie. I do apologize, Leslie, again, getting those to you yesterday. They got buried in some of the others, but there were some questions that came to you. I just give you an opportunity to address those, and then you can, if you want, you can just roll right into the budget question process and how that works, so that folks who are not familiar with that can understand how that works back and forth between APS and the board.
Sure. All right. So the questions that were received, were there any specifics around the one-time funds from the county? Was it to fund a particular item? No, the one-time funds from the county are just a direct result of increased assessments. We see that anytime the assessments go up, there's a one-time piece of that because some of that is in June. rather than in the next fiscal year. For the expected, hopeful increase in state revenue, do we expect this higher amount to be ongoing in future years, or a portion of it could end up being one time only? That's a really great question. I don't know the answer to that. I guess it would really depend on, a lot of this is, sales tax revenue and other revenue that has been increasing. Obviously, if the revenue doesn't increase, if it stays the same or increases a little bit more, you'll be fine. If it goes down, then we'll have less revenue. But it's not it's not considered one time in the same way that they say, okay, here it is for 1 year. Don't expect it the year after that. We would expect to get the same amount the following year, with the hope that the economy stays on track. For the additional investment in special education and EL, are we funding a growth in students in this area or making up for general underinvestment, or a combination of both? Also a good question. I believe, and I'm not 100% on this, I believe the answer is that we have an uptick in our percentage of English learners and about the same percentage of special education students. But as our enrollment grows, then that means that there are more of those students. The other issue is that we're finding that those students have more need, so we need to provide more resources to those students. Of the 33.5 million investment in compensation, how much of this will add to the ongoing budget versus one time? It's all ongoing. It changes the salary scales, it changes everybody's salaries, so that would be ongoing. Will the results of the Bell Time study have any impact on the FY23 budget? It's possible that it will. I don't know that we will know in time for the adoption of the budget. With lower predicted extended day revenue, that implies there are no wait lists at the schools and any family can enroll, or is it driven by staffing shortages? Currently, it's driven by staffing shortages. We definitely still have wait lists at some schools, but that's a direct result of staffing shortages.
Are you going to be talking again?
Yeah. Somebody has their mic open. Can you please mute?
Eric, that would be you.
Those are the questions that I had, that I received. So the budget question process is that a school board member can ask questions at a budget work session. And if we don't have an answer that we can provide them right away, then we will note the question and then we add it to our budget question list. And then the other way that school board members can ask questions is they can email them to the superintendent as they come up during any discussions or their review of the budget. Thank you, Ms. Diaz-Torres, for your question this evening. Then we add it to the list, and the list gets parsed out to the department that can best answer the question. We collect all the responses from the departments, and we then get the responses, we review them, the superintendent reviews them, and then we send them out each Friday to the school board, and then they get posted on board docs. And I don't know that we've posted them on the BAC or on the budget website yet, but we will. So we had our first set go out on Friday, but there was only one question and one response because that's all we were able to answer last week. Currently, I will warn you that currently I think we have 90 questions in the hopper at the moment. It's around that. If it's not that, it's close to that. So any questions that you provide or that you bring to Chuck to send to me will be answered in the order in which it was received after all of the school board questions are answered. So just be aware that we have some offices that are trying to answer a lot of questions right now. But those budget questions and responses, as I said, will come out every Friday, and we will provide those to you. We'll send them send them out to the BAC as well.
And I would say that process is extremely helpful because, you know, a lot of it, you know, we'll have similar questions as the board. So we can, you know, take some of the more common stuff off the table, but it's always illuminating to kind of get a sense from the questions that are posed, kind of maybe where some of the board's thinking is. And so, you know, sort of a way to read some of the tea leaves, as it were, on, you know, maybe where the board is, you know, different members of the board are thinking, and you know, the types of questions that they're posing. Leslie, one question I had for you, if you could remind me, the state tax revenue projection comes out, is it in a couple weeks, where we'll get the final figure for what we'll get in state revenue?
Oh, the General Assembly was due to adopt their budget by Sunday, but it appears that is not going to happen because the House and Senate are pretty divided on tax cuts and other issues. So it could drag on for a little while. For us, the House amendments and the Senate amendments are very different. The Senate amendments actually provide us with about $1.4 million more than we have in the superintendent's proposed budget. The House amendments actually decrease revenue by about $3.9 million. So guess which one we're rooting for?
Yeah. And so for the group, obviously, you know, how the General Assembly comes in will, you know, be a much closer to budget adoption decision in terms of how we address if there are gaps or if there are more funds. You know, it does work both ways. But, you know, that's just something I'd like everyone to keep in the back of your minds, that, you know, the revenue projections that Leslie and the team have put together in the budget are pretty solid, but there are some that are still due win. And so those you know, the top line number can change. And, you know, I think we should expect that it will change, but how much that changes is to be seen. Any questions for Leslie as far as the budget question process? I mean, it's pretty straightforward. It's pretty informative. If y'all have questions outside of that, just ask that you send those to me, and then I'll do a periodic push to Leslie. You know, normally what we'll do is we'll wait for the budget questions to come out on Friday and see which of those questions are already reconciled or answered, and then those that are not answered, then we'll go ahead and submit for the team, and they can get to those as time and effort are available.
And any questions that I think I can answer, you know, just in this arena, in this format when we're meeting, I certainly will, as I just showed with the questions that were sent previously. So, you know, if there are questions that are really easy to answer, you know, I might save those and bring them back to you guys next week, and we'll just talk through them versus, you know, going through and writing them down and sending you written responses.
I appreciate it. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to bring up talk through the last part of the schedule here, just to give everybody a sense of, you know, where, you know, kind of where we are in the overall scheme of things. But if you guys can see, you know, at the bottom here of the agenda that went out, you know, these are the different meetings between now and May 12th when the budget is to be adopted. What I do want to hone in on here is this work session, April 5th. Obviously, it's a little bit out of cycle in terms of us directly participating in a work session as a body. So a couple of things that, I still need to sort out in my mind, and, obviously, in discussion with all of you. One is, just, the makeup of our presentation, how we go about doing that, and then how, in the hour that they've allotted us, how we use that time. Now, one thing I will put on the table, Dr. Cannon asked if it were helpful to us to switch our 1 hour session to the 21st of April to work session 6. Obviously that would give us more time to consider our input, but it's at the expense of the school board, and their proposed budget on the 7th. So, it's really a trade-off of what time we need as a group to come up with our top line level advice to the school board versus waiting and having more time to get more and better information, but then our advice may not be as timely to the school board as they go into their portion of the budget. So, there's a trade-off of moving, from work session 5 to work session 6 that we need to consider. If you have thoughts about that, please, direct those to me. I'm not sure which way I want to go yet. I mean, I'm inclined to make sure that we have an opportunity to weigh in prior to the school board's proposed budget. I think that's the most timely, but, obviously, we want to make sure that we have sufficient opportunity to form our advice and opinions about the budget. But, I think all things being equal, my inclination is to keep it on the 5th. But if anyone has thoughts on that, certainly welcome to voice those to me, and, we can consider, if a postponement really is in the best interest of this group. As we look ahead, we have, obviously, our next meeting is next Wednesday, same time, 7 o'clock. What I'd like to do is, do a quick turn on the comments that were presented tonight. And really what I want to use next week for is to look ahead to the advice portion of our work. And, really, one is, what is our theme or narrative about the budget, but then also what are the specific or substantive points that we are interested in raising, and what kind of work do we need to do to get from, these views, like, for example, Bridget's well-articulated views about equity, and, how much more do we need to explore in an area like that and be able to come to some degree of, how do we frame that advice for the school board in a way that will be useful to them, but also conveys a sense of, where the BAC may be on, different funding options. If we believe that there's underinvestment in certain schools versus others, as an example, how might we frame that issue for the school board to consider? So what I'd like everyone to do is, based on the discussions that they've heard tonight, is to really think about, the top line items that we can start to coalesce around, and really then it's, what additional information we need to best posture ourselves to, framing that advice in a way that will be useful for the school board to consider. That's really the direction I'd like to go next Wednesday, is to start to develop the broad strokes of what that advice is going to look like. One other area to consider and I just lost the thought. So if it comes back to me, I'll put it in the email, after the meeting. But, really, just starting to, I think, try to coalesce around what advice we want to start to consider, or we really don't understand enough about this area. And so would it be helpful to bring in either other members of the staff or other board member, whomever might be the best person positioned to give us a little bit more information about a particular area that we may not yet understand. And so we want to get a little bit smarter on, now that we have a budget, some of the specifics behind some of the investments or things that are being made, if that would be helpful as well. Would love to hear feedback from you if there's a part of the budget that you don't think we're well positioned, or we need better understanding on, then we can ask to either get more information directly, or if we need to bring someone in to speak to us as a group, how the timing and how we do that. The last thing I would say is, in terms of the investments in the budget, compensation obviously is a huge portion of the increase in the overall budget. So I do encourage everyone to look at the recording of the work session on compensation. It's important to understand, I think of all the things being done in this budget, it's the most consequential in terms of its impact both now, but also in the future. So I think that's important for us to make sure we that everyone has at least some baseline level of understanding of where APS is looking to go with respect to staff compensation. Is pretty important. Leslie or Christina, anything that I missed with respect to the timeline as it lays out, or anything you'd like to highlight or add?
I will defer to Christina. I don't believe so.
I think you've covered all of it.
Last thing I'll leave with the group, and then we'll move to adjourn. Especially for those who are going through this for the first time, it's okay to feel a bit overwhelmed. It's a big document, it's a big budget. I think, to put it in comparison, the amount of spending that we're doing in Arlington County is about roughly on par with the level of the state education budget of Kansas, where I came from. So I mean, in terms of scale for a county, I mean, this is a big budget. So it's okay to feel overwhelmed or not really sure. That's okay. We have sufficient time between now and ultimately May, when we need to put an end-of-year report really into practice and get that around to the group. We have a lot of time to try to get to where we need to be as a group about, one, rendering our advice in April, but also the report that we'll put together at the end that will talk about how we really our views now, but looking ahead to the next year and using that report to help shape guidance and direction for next year's budget. If there's any areas that you need to get smart on, that it would be helpful to have folks come in, or if there's different presentations or different things that are out there that would help you better understand particular areas of the budget, please send those to me, and work with Leslie and the team to help us get the information we need to be able to provide the best advice we can. Again, different budget environment, it's okay. I think in some ways this is a good problem to have, that we can actually talk about investment for the first time in some time. Doesn't mean it's perfect, and particularly for those who've expressed some views that there are areas that are not, in your judgment, we're not there yet. I think this is our opportunity as a group to get smarter on all those things and really advocate for these different things that we do care about, whether it's overcoming achievement gaps, staffing, things of that nature. But this is really our opportunity to be advocates on behalf of, the other parents who aren't as directly involved in this process. So, feel free to share your views with your neighbors, your friends that are part of this process. You might learn some things out there, things that are on their mind that we're not talking about, and that's all part of this process. So, as we engage, our neighbors and our friends in the community, that's also an opportunity for us to seek additional input and hear what's on their mind. You might be surprised some of the things that come up that perhaps we're not thinking about either. Any final questions before we move to adjourn? Okay. With that, is a motion to adjourn?
I move to adjourn, Chuck.
Okay, I see Josh's comment there. Okay, yep, thank you, Josh. We'll make sure. All right, do I have a second?
I second the motion.
Okay, all right. All those in favor, raise your hand. All right, motion carries. I thank everyone for their participation tonight. Work begins, and I will see. I know a couple of you have gotten with me offline about whether or not you can attend next Wednesday or some of the other sessions. So if you do have some conflicts with your personal professional schedules, again, this is kind of the time of year for us where we have to. We do a little bit more than what we've done in the past. So if you have some of those conflicts, just let me know. With that, I will see those of you who will be on next week, Wednesday at 7. I'll see all of you then. Thank you.
Thank you, Chuck. Thank you, everybody.
Good night, everybody.
Good night.